For my project, I'm focusing on intergroup cognition, specifically linking the development of implicit biases to constructs such as the social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism in children. A 2011 study by Dunham et al. Examined whether minimal group membership in children ages 5 could produce in-group preference through 5 experiments. Participants were randomly assigned to 2 groups, one of which wore red t-shirts and one of which wore blue t-shirts, with following experiments swapping the red shirts for orange shirts to avoid effects resulting from a general preference for red. After group assignment, children were given several tasks in which they were to judge in-group and out-group members in the absence of interaction or competition with the other group. The study found that in-group preference was triggered via random minimal group assignment on measures of implicit and explicit bias, as well as resource allocation. A 2014 study by Buttleman and Baum aimed to identify the developmental trajectory of motives underlying in-group bias. Researchers categorized motivations for social behaviors into in-group love, which is biasing your own group out of love for your own group, and out-group hate, which is actively derogating the other group even if it has no benefit for your group. The study was done on 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds who were separated into groups via random assignment, and groups were either distinguished by a green shirt or a yellow shirt. Participants then interacted with in-group and out-group puppets and were allowed to allocate positive and negative resources by placing them into boxes, either to their own in-group, to a neutral box where the item goes to no one, or to give items to the out-group. Researchers found that at the age of 6, children's primary motivation was in-group love, with them giving less negative resources to the out-group and putting most into the neutral box, with out-group hate emerging around age 8. Melzoff's 2007 review on similarity bias aimed to review experiments on imitation, gaze following, social categorization, and infancy. Melzoff's paper describes how early imitation and self-other equivalence lay the foundation for social cognition and in-group preferences, while shared characteristics increase social bonding in infancy through similarity bias. Melzoff's review suggests that infants show preferential looking and prosociality more towards similar others, and that similarity bias may guide learning and affiliation towards in-group members, even in pre-verbal infants. While much work has been done on implicit bias in children, surprisingly little work has been done on the potential links between personality development and the development of implicit bias. In attempting to research this link, I drew on social dominance theory, right-wing authoritarianism, and the 5-factor model. None of these factors have been examined in the context of implicit bias. However, there's plenty of research existing linking them to explicit bias, both in adults and some in children as well. A 2019 study by Crawford and Brandt aimed to identify how big 5 traits relate to explicit prejudice in adults. The study used a large, diverse sample of adults and utilized cross-sectional surveys. Researchers measured Big 5 traits and correlations between trait levels and prejudice towards political, religious, and lifestyle groupings. Findings indicated that openness negatively predicted prejudice towards low status and unconventional groups, and conscientiousness positively predicted prejudice towards unconventional groups. Interestingly, agreeableness is consistently linked to lower prejudice across the board. A 2020 study by Ruffman et al. Aimed to create and test measures for right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation in children. The paper consisted of 5 studies, 2 which validated the new scales by using adults to correlate scores between the adult and child versions of the scale, and 3 more experiments with children's ages 5 to 12, measuring parent-child correlations between RWA and SDO scores, and correlating RWA and SDO scores to out-group helping behavior, racial prejudice, and anti-fat prejudice. The study was able to establish reliability for both scales, establishing a link between maternal SDO scores and child RWA and SDO scores. It also suggested that higher RWA and SDO is linked to increased choice of same-race playmates and anti-fat prejudice. SDO and RWA decrease over childhood, however levels of prejudice tend to remain relatively stable with age. A 2020 study done by Katamuro et al. Aimed to validate long and short forms of the SDO6 scale in children and explore the relationship between in-group and out-group attitudes and SDO6 scores. The study consisted of 271 Italian children between the ages of 8 and 14 who were administered child-adapted SDO6 long and short scales and Big Five child-adapted scales before being measured on dispositional empathy, intergroup empathy, openness to experience, agreeableness, neuroticism, attitudinal bias, and stereotypical bias. The findings suggested that a two-factor SDO model, which separates social dominance into dominance and anti-egalitarianism, was valid within this age range, and that both factors of SDO predicted attitudinal and stereotypical bias. They also interestingly found that agreeableness and openness to experience were negatively correlated with SDO measures, a trend observed in adult samples as well. The study further concluded that the short form of the SDO is more reliable in children aged 8 and older. In synthesizing the literature on intergroup cognition, we can see that early mechanisms of social categorization, such as similarity bias, emerge in preverbal infants. Implicit biases emerge early and rapidly, and they can be shaped by many sources, highlighted in an article by Rudman in 2004. Furthermore, implicit biases can be induced by minimal group membership, even in the absence of social cues such as competition. Such biases are first motivated by in-group love before out-group hate emerges around the age of 8. Pivoting to the influence of personality on intergroup bias, several studies have looked at the influence of personality on explicit prejudice, with openness and agreeableness lowering explicit prejudice and SDO and RWA measures predicting several forms of prejudice. The synthesis highlights an interesting gap in the literature, whereby there are currently no studies addressing personality as a potential moderator for the development of implicit bias. This gap suggests an intersection between social dominance theory and developmental intergroup theory that has not yet been empirically tested. To address a potential link between personality development and implicit biases in childhood, I'm devising a study which seeks to explore personality through the SDO6 and RWA as a moderator on the magnitude of implicit bias in children. To do this, we will assess whether the SDO6 and RWA scores predict implicit bias, following a similar minimal group induction that was seen in Dunham et al.'s study on the consequences of minimal group affiliations in children. This study has the aim of informing research on potential childhood interventions to lessen the development of implicit prejudice and to aid in better understanding the intersection of personality development and implicit bias. Working off of findings regarding explicit prejudice by Katamuro et al. And Ruffman et al., I predict that lower levels of RWA and SDO will predict lower levels of implicit bias, while higher levels of RWA and SDO will be correlated with higher levels of implicit bias. Due to the differential developmental course of RWA and SDO seen in Ruffman et al.'s study, I predict that RWA and SDO will moderate implicit bias independent from one another. Finally, I hypothesize that RWA levels will decrease with age in line with findings from Ruffman et al., while SDO will be comparatively moderate in terms of its decline with age. In line with Kadmuro et al.'s study, we are going to use the short version of the SDO6 since it has greater reliability in children ages 8 and above. Thus, our participants are going to range between 8 and 11, as the scale is less reliable below the age of 8. To avoid potential confounding variables regarding socialization, we will follow the same minimal group initiation done in the study by Dunham et al. In order to avoid participant fatigue effects, we are going to stick to using the short version of the SDO6 from Kadmuro et al.'s study and the RWAC scale from Ruffman et al.'s study. As shown in Kadmuro et al.'s study, social dominance is correlated with low openness and low agreeableness. So in the interest of time, and since these two personality traits are moderators of explicit prejudice in adults, We're going to forego the direct measurement of the big five traits in order to prevent the potential for fatigue effects. The IAT will consist of one trial, in which participants link positive and negative words with bugs and flowers. This method has been verified in previous studies, such as the 2005 study by Banerjee et al. And then we will counterbalance congruent conditions and incongruent conditions, with congruent conditions consisting of linking positive words with pictures of in-group members and negative words with pictures of out-group members, and incongruent conditions linking positive words with out-group members and negative words with in-group members. As seen in Kadmuro et al. And Ruffman et al., the effect of RWA and SDO is likely to be small to moderate. This is expected as several variables have been discovered to moderate implicit attitudes, for example, as shown in Rudman et al.'s 2004 study. Previous research by Barron and Banerjee has shown implicit pro-white racial attitudes to be consistent throughout life, so average levels of implicit bias are likely to be stable across participants. Because of the developmental course of RWA described in Ruffman et al.'s study, SDO will have more predictive validity, specifically as age increases due to its stability. If my predictions are correct, these results would establish a link between personality and implicit bias in children, opening the door for research on specific Big Five traits and bias, SDO and RWA levels and bias, and potential interventions. Since SDO is linked to openness to experience, agreeableness, and neuroticism, future studies and interventions, such as empathy training, could be used in targeting specific traits to better understand the mechanisms by which personality influences implicit bias. If RWA is predictive of implicit bias and lowers with age, as was seen in Ruffman et al.'s study, then my findings may point to RWA as a potential moderator by which implicit biases are learned and encoded. And due to its decrease with age, this link would also make RWA a particularly important factor for future interventions. Given our narrow range and single cultural context, generalizability to other populations will need to be tested in future research. However, this would offer a promising first step.